Hey everybody, it's Joe with J Blake Photo. I'm back with another video and I wanted to chat for just a minute about some of the things that I did on my recent trip to make it really easy to make vlogs and shoot B-roll. So one of the things that can really improve the overall quality of your shots, whether it's your B-roll or your general vlog footage, or even if you're interviewing someone, or maybe you're shooting an event or some sort of a live activity, is to make sure that you have your shutter speed, your depth of field, and your ISO set properly. Now that can vary depending on what it is you're shooting, but in the case that I want to talk about today is specifically shooting vlog footage like this, but also shooting B-roll that you see slipped into all kinds of vlogs on YouTube. So I've seen a lot of different videos about this, about what to do, and then different videos about why, and then different videos about how it works. So I wanted to boil it down and make it really simple. So there's a couple of rules. So the first thing is you want to make sure that your shutter speed and your frame rate are related. So right now, for example, I'm shooting with a frame rate of 30 frames per second. In order to get a decent cinematic look, I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second shutter speed. What that means is that each of my frames contains 1/60th of a second of light. In order to keep my footage cinematic, I want to keep my shutter speed double my frame rate. So right now I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, but I have a shutter speed of 1/60th. In order to get good cinematic footage, you want to make sure that your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So right now I'm shooting at a frame rate of 30 frames per second, and I've got a shutter speed of 1/60th. That does one very important thing. It sets the motion blur to be appropriate for the frame rate. I want to show you an example of what 30 frames per second looks like with a lower shutter speed. So now we're still shooting at 30 frames a second, but I've reduced the shutter to 1/30th of a second. That means that every frame you're seeing is exactly what the sensor is picking up. So the other thing that you'll see is that the blur is considerably more prevalent, right? It's more noticeable with the blur. So my hand kind of smooths across the screen a lot more than it was at 1/60th. You do want a little bit of motion blur, but you don't want so much that you make it look real fuzzy or creamy. So now let's increase the shutter speed to double what we normally would. So we're gonna go from 1/60th to 1/25th. Okay, so now we're at 1/25th of a second shutter speed. We're still at 30 frames a second, okay? Nothing's changed there. And now you'll notice that my hand is a lot jerkier. Okay, there's a lot less motion blur, if any at all. Let's jack it all the way up to 1/400th of a second. Okay, so now we're still shooting at 30 frames a second, but we got 1/500th of a second. Now I've had to boost up my ISO. You might even notice a little bit of a flicker from my lights with that high of a shutter speed, but check this out. No motion blur. You could literally pause any frame in this video and you would see my hand still with no blur whatsoever. Let's take it back down to 1/60th. Okay, so that should feel a bit more natural. There's still some motion blur going on, but it is not herky-jerky, but it's also not super smooth either. Okay, so now if I'm shooting at 30 frames a second and I'm doing vlog-like footage like this, or if I'm shooting at 24 and I want to create good quality cinematic video, I've got to make sure that I have those settings right. So the other thing that I try and do is I try and shoot with a wide open aperture. Now right now the lens that I have on here is capable of a 2.8 aperture. Let me show you the difference between a 2.8 and let's say f5.6. Okay, so now we're still shooting at 30 frames a second. We're still at 1/60th of a second in terms of our shutter speed, but now I've significantly dropped down my f-stop, or the aperture size in my lens. What that does is lets in less light, but it also makes the focus distance, or the plane of focus of my lens, considerably longer. And what does that mean? It means more of my background is in focus. When I'm shooting vlogs, I normally want that nice creamy background, so I normally like to shoot with a lower aperture, f2.8 if possible, on this lens. The other thing that it does is lets in a lot less light because that aperture is smaller. As a result, I have to either boost my ISO or drop my shutter speed. Now, if you think about it, if your shutter speed has to be locked to double what your frame rate is, really the only thing that you can change is your ISO. And depending on the quality of your camera, pushing your ISO too far could result in a much lower quality image. Okay, now I'm back to an aperture of f2.8. I'm still at 1/60th of a second. Right now I'm actually shooting at ISO 400, in case you're curious. So when you're vlogging, remember, if you want to have great cinematic footage, you kind of have to start with that frame rate and that shutter speed. Depending on the capability of your lenses, you might want to have a wider open aperture. You might be forced with a smaller aperture. And then depending on the quality of the sensor in your camera, you may want to vary your ISO settings, depending on you're shooting outside or if you're shooting inside. You've heard me talk a lot in recent videos about ND filters, and I'm not sure if everyone in my audience knows what that is or how those work. If you do, congratulations, that's awesome. I've known about ND filters for a long time, but there was a period of time where I had no idea what they were, and there was an even longer period of time where I wasn't using them. And so now I am, and I want to tell you about why they're important. So we talked about shutter speed. So let's say that you lock that shutter speed down to 1/60th. You're vlogging, right? You got your camera rig out. You've got your 30 frames per second, maybe you're shooting at 60, maybe you're shooting at 24, and you've got your shutter speed dialed in right where it needs to be. For an outdoor scene, 1/60th of a second, especially if you have your aperture wide open to get that nice creamy blurry background, which means that you have a lot of light coming into your camera, means that you're going to dial down your sensitivity or your ISO down to the lowest level. For most cameras that's 100, for some it's 50. Even then you're going to be looking at a very white or very blown out scene. So that's where ND filters come in. I have all my filters in this nice purple case here. And if I pull out my ND filter, so this is a variable ND filter. What this does is allow me to control how much light comes in and out of the camera before it even gets to those settings. The great part here is that if I'm outdoor in a really bright sunlit scene, I can throw this filter on the camera and I can end up getting the settings that I want. That 1/60th of a second shutter speed with a 30 frames per second frame rate. I can keep my aperture all the way open and I can keep my ISO at 100. But as the day goes on, it might get a little darker. So I might want to turn that down, but I don't want to change my settings. I want to keep my settings right where they are, keep them dialed in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the variable side of this ND filter. So it gets a little bit darker, which is really nice. So you can go from this, which is the minimum, all the way to as dark as it gets, which is super dark. Now, so this is a variable one. I also have, somewhere, I also have a non-variable. Really kind of depends on the situation in terms of when you're going to want it, but I really do like that variable filter. Kind of depends on the situation in terms of when you're going to want these, but honestly, I love having these filters. It makes it a lot easier for me to vlog. So we've talked about some of the settings that I use and using the neutral density filters to help me keep those settings right where they need to be, but that's specifically for vlogging. So let me talk a little bit about B-roll. So I use B-roll, and a lot of people on YouTube, a lot of YouTubers use B-roll to spice up their footage. So if I'm going out on a hike, I might have vlog footage of my face where I'm talking to you and I'm letting you know what I'm doing, and then I may want to cut to drone footage, or I may want to cut to B-roll footage. And B-roll footage allows me to kind of give you an idea of the environment that I'm in. Sometimes I can talk at the camera for a long period of time, but it doesn't really express the beauty or the complexity or just kind of the amount of interest in that particular scene. And the only way that I can do it is to show it to you. Now when I shoot vlogs, I shoot at 30 frames per second, but if I'm shooting B-roll, I shoot at 60 frames a second. Now depending on the camera that you have, sometimes you can shoot faster or slower. Not all cameras have a 1080p 60 frame per second mode. Some do a 120 frame per second mode at 1080. Some have super high-res 4K. My iPhone will shoot 4K at 60 frames a second. It'll shoot 1080p at 120 or 240 frames a second. So really, depending on the camera that you have, what that slow-mo does, what that higher frame rate does, is it gives you the ability in post to import that footage, slow it down, and make it look really smooth and cinematic. It really kind of gives your audience a feel for the environment environment that you're in. Now, I also shoot that footage at 2.8 aperture, trying to keep it nice and wide open. I like the focus plane. I like the creaminess of the background. It just looks really good and cinematic to me. It's up to you, depends on what you're shooting. And then I try and set my ISO to be as low as I possibly can. Now, the other thing different between when I'm shooting vlogging footage like I am now and when I'm shooting B-roll is that when I'm shooting B-roll, I normally use the log setting or the log style that I have in my camera. Depending on the DSLR you have, you might have a log setting. You might have to put in a custom style like I did on my Canon 60 Mark II, or if you don't have those, you can still try and adjust your settings to just be as flat as possible so that when you get it into your video editor, you can go and do color correction and color grading to make it look really nice and cinematic. When I'm shooting vlog footage, I just set the camera to portrait mode and it works just fine. Honestly, I'm not super interested in color grading this type of video. I really only want to color grade the B-roll and the really cool stuff. I do the same thing with drone footage. I shoot that in D-Log and then I color correct and color grade later in post. So those are the main tips that I can give you in terms of shooting vlog footage versus shooting B-roll footage for your YouTube videos. Is when you're shooting 30 frames a second, make sure that you're doubling that at 1/60th for your shutter speed. Keep your ISO as low as you can and try and open up the aperture to give yourself a nice cinematic background if possible. Also, when you're shooting vlog footage, go with a preset on your camera just to make it fast to edit. It'll make it a little bit easier for you, and then pay attention and really kind of pour your time into color grading and color correcting your B-roll footage and maybe your drone footage. When you switch over to B-roll and drone footage, go ahead and double your frame rate. So you're going to be shooting at maybe 60 frames a second. When you do that, make sure you double your shutter speed. So if you go up to 60 frames a second, you're going to go up to 120 or 150, or in my case 125 or 1/125th on your camera for your shutter speed. Keep your aperture open and still keep your ISO as low as you possibly can. That way you get the best possible picture. If you're shooting B-roll or you're shooting vlog footage out in the sunny day, get a neutral density filter. It's really, really going to help you. Also, when you're shooting B-roll, try to shoot in log or the flattest color profile possible. So with those two specific sets of settings, you should come out with some pretty good vlog footage that's easy to edit, and also some great B-roll that'll be really kind of set for you to color grade and put together. So there's one more thing I want to tell you about, but before I can, I need to switch over to the iPhone so that I can show you on this camera. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to the iPhone now. Okay, so now I'm on the iPhone. So I wanna show you these settings for the Canon camera. So let me show you the settings that I have right now on the 60 Mark II. So right now I've got my shutter speed set to 1/25th, and I have my, my aperture set to 2.8. I also have my color style, my picture style set to a custom setting, which if we go into the details, you'll see is a special setting specifically for flat shooting. Now, if I was shooting vlog footage, I would change this. Let me go back here. If I was shooting vlog, I would set this to 1/60th, and I would keep that at 2.8. I would keep that at auto, and I'd probably set this to portrait. And those are going to be the settings that I want for shooting vlog footage. Now, one thing that I have happen to me all the time is I'll go into, shooting vlog footage, and then I'll want to switch to shooting B-roll, and I'll forget to change some of these settings. So I'll have vlog footage that's in flat profile, I'll have B-roll that's in 1/30th or 1/60th of a second, and it's just a pain. So there's a setting on Canon cameras, and I don't know if you have it on all of your other fancy cameras like Nikon or Sony, but here's just, this thing is a lifesaver. Oh, the other thing I want to show you is the focus settings. So the focus settings, when you're in movie mode, is you can choose to detect faces, zone AF, or point AF. Detecting faces works exceptionally well on Canon cameras. The zone AF is kind of a disaster, and the point focus is actually pretty good. So I can actually set that here, or set it here, or here, or here. It actually works pretty well. But if I'm shooting vlog footage, I want it to be shooting with focus on my face, and if I'm shooting B-roll, I want it to focus on whatever my subject is. So all those settings, right? Your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, your picture mode, your focusing setup, all those things are all things that I need to change every time I flip between shooting vlog and shooting B-roll. So what I've done is I go into my menu, and first I make sure that I have all my settings the way that I want them, right? So right now, this would be like I was shooting for vlog. So I've got it on facial tracking, got it on 29.97 or 30 frames per second, and I've got my picture style set to portrait, which works really well for vlog footage. So that's about how I want it. So now what I want to do is I want to register this to work on one of the custom mode buttons that I have on the dial up here on the Canon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to hit my menu button, and I'm going to go into my settings, and I'm going to go over here to custom controls, and I'm going to click on custom shooting mode, and I'm going to register settings. And what this will do is when I set my settings to, if you look up here, if I set my settings to 1, so right now I'm on M for manual, but if I set my settings to 1 here, you'll actually see that all my settings are the way that I want them. And then I've actually done a second one over in setting 2 here. And now you'll see that I've got my shutter speed set to 1/25. You'll actually see that it's changed the focus from the facial recognition to the point focus. Now you see this little thing that's flashing here, okay? What that is, if I'm using a Canon lens that supports it, I can actually get additional stabilization, which is really, really nice for B-roll. This particular camera is a Tamron, so it doesn't support it, but if I was shooting with any of my Canon lenses, I would be able to do that. Okay, so let's switch back to the Canon. Okay, so I just wanted to show you some of the settings that I use, as well as those registered custom modes that you can do on Canon cameras. You can do that on a lot of their DSLRs. I'm sure that a lot of other camera manufacturers have similar options for different environments or different settings. It really saves a lot of time. The main thing is that if I'm not spending all my time worrying about my settings or worrying to check that I've flipped the right switch or enabled the right focusing mode, then I can actually concentrate on the content that I'm creating and not worry as much about my settings. Anyway, so those are the settings that I use on my vlogs and when I'm shooting B-roll, so I hope you enjoy those. I'm still editing the footage from my trip through some of these national parks out here in southern Utah and to Antelope Canyon and Horseshoe Bend, so check those out. I'm really proud of those. I'm really proud of what I came up with in that trip. Not everything went as smoothly as I wanted. The weather was a huge factor, but if you're interested in stuff like that, please subscribe to my channel. Go ahead and hit like, go ahead and hit share, and I'll see you in the next video.